Welcome back to Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers, the podcast devoted to exploring the frontiers of psychedelic medicine and what it takes to cultivate a healthy mind, body, and spirit. I'm Dr. Steve Thayer, and today my co-host, Dr. Reid Robison, and I discuss breathwork. Breathwork is, it's all the rage in the wellness community right now, but humans have been using the power of breath to heal and transform for thousands of years. Reid and I discuss a variety of breathwork practices in today's episode and explore the similarities between certain of those practices and psychedelic medicine experiences. I want to thank you for your emails, your YouTube comments. Remember, you can email us at psychfrontiers@novamind.ca if you have questions, or if you'd like to recommend an episode idea, or even a guest that you'd like to hear us talk to. And if you want to interact with Reid and I on social media, we're on Instagram. Reid's at InnerSpaceDoctor. I'm at Dr. Steve Thayer. All right, let's enjoy this episode on breathwork.
Hey, Steve.
Hey.
How you feeling? I guess we're online because you were ill.
Yeah, we're going to be talking about breath and breathing and breathwork today. It's I guess appropriate because it burns when I breathe. So,
Oh,
excuse me.
dang. You've got that
Yeah.
burn breathing disease?
Yeah, who knows what it is. I tested negative for COVID, but it's probably COVID because everyone has it right now, and those tests are often inaccurate. So I am in my spare bedroom, this tiny little concrete box in my basement. But since Reid and I are committed to this podcast and to you, our lovely listeners, we're recording this episode.
Well, thanks for getting back on your feet or your seat for this, Steve.
Yeah, out of the bed and onto the seat.
Did you ever have COVID before?
Not that I've never tested positive. I mean,
Yeah.
I got sick, I think one other time. It was shortly after we got back from New York. We went to Horizons. I think. Anyway, it was around that time. But yeah, I've tested many times and never tested positive. Who knows?
Well, would you like to hear a poem about breathing?
Always. The answer to that question is always yes.
Okay, this is by someone named A. de la Madriz, and I don't know what A stands for. I forget. But here it goes. One breath at a time, we unlock the secrets of our past, those old scars that bleed into the deep tissues of ourselves, holding us back, making us dense and heavy. One movement at a time, we feel the weight of our suffering, the struggles that have gone and those yet to come, creating imbalance and angst within our soul. One gaze at a time, we focus on building the fire, illuminating the dark corners within, melting the unease in our hearts, igniting the light of our spirit, awakening the awareness of our ethereal nature. One count at a time, we expand, we contract, we spiral out of our physical bodies into the consciousness within. We lift our hearts to the world, exposing the vulnerable and beautiful fabric of our emotions. All in this sacred space, in the gray light of each dawning day. One breath, one movement, one gaze, one count at a time, we arise out of the ashes of our former selves like a phoenix and we fly.
Sounds very psychedelic.
Yeah, it's kind of a yoga poem talking about a practice, a breathing, moving meditation.
Yeah, I mean, it sounded transcendent, transpersonal, and spiritual,
Like we spiral out of our physical bodies into the consciousness within.
Yeah.
That kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah. And I've certainly, that's not my experience with regular day-to-day breathing. I can tell you that much, but it has been my experience with some of the breath work strategies, techniques, exercises, practices we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, this is going to be fun. So maybe we could start there if you have a little story to tell about psychedelic breath work, because I think it's important to point out that when we talk about breath work, it means a lot of things these days. And I like to look at them as breathing practices versus kind of psychedelic breath work. And we can tease those apart more as we go.
Well, I like the term breath work, right? Because, of course, if we stop breathing, we die eventually. Like breathing is something that our nervous system, our brain does without us having to think about it. It's something you can control voluntarily, but it's also one of those interesting body functions that will do it on its own, and you can take the steering wheel, right?
Oh yeah.
There are other body functions we can't really do that. Like I can't, at least I can't take the steering wheel of my heart rate or my digestion in any particular way. Those
Yeah.
things happen on their own.
Yeah, it's fascinating because we have these things in our body, these parts that are like our arms are voluntary for the most part. Our heart, for the most part, is involuntary. Sure, you could learn to speed it up, slow it down within reason, but the diaphragm and therefore our breath is both. And because of this and other reasons, people view it as a bridge that links the conscious and the unconscious, those functions of our body in our awareness and beneath the surface.
Yeah, and as a bridge, it's like, we, often in our when we do exercises with our clients around breath, we'll talk about the breath being the remote control for the nervous system. That
Hmm.
it's a way, because of its bridge-like nature, though it's connected to these other systems in the body, to influence those systems that we don't necessarily have direct control over. So you manipulate the breath to manipulate the heart rate, manipulate the breath to manipulate, the neuroendocrine system, the immune system even.
Yeah, I like that. I like what you said about influencing these other systems. Control the breath, control the mind. Or my working definition these days for breath work is just intentional breathing. Like breathing plus attention, intention, and the movement of energy is breath work. So we essentially control the length and depth of our inhales or exhales to influence our cognitive or emotional states. And that could encompass both the breathing based practices or yoga based breathing, some might call it, and the breath work journeys like holotropic and rebirthing and all these other kinds, shamanic.
Right. Yeah, so that adding that word work to breath. These are deliberate. They are, there's only so many knobs we can, twist, and levers we can pull with respect to the breath. So there's only so many variables you can change, but it's what separates the breath work practices from just normal day-to-day breathing. But um, we might also talk about how you can change your normal day-to-day breathing to also enhance your sense of well-being and your physical health. Like most of us, we either are over breathers or under breathers. And there's, we can talk about mouth breathing and the difference between mouth breathing and nasal breathing, that
Hmm.
kind of stuff. But you asked me a question that I didn't answer, and that was just sort of stories or examples of this altered state of consciousness via breath.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, my most recent experience was actually at a workshop we did for some of our clinicians, where we were talking about what we call the essential domains of psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. And you guided us in a breathwork exercise combined with sound that would probably closely resemble what's called the holotropic breathwork exercise. I know that there's
Hmm.
some, the Groffs are very particular about what you call holotropic and not, uh, but yeah, it was short. It wasn't hours long like a typical holotropic session might be.
Yeah.
It was what 10-15 minutes. Uh, but holy cow! Like I entered an altered state pretty quickly, where I felt fairly euphoric. I felt like I wanted to. I think what I said was I wanted to get up and run through a wall. Like
Hmm.
I felt energized. I felt powerful. I felt expressive. Like I was connected to a part of myself that didn't get a chance to express himself, like from this part's perspective.
Hmm.
And it was great. I even had a few insights about things I'd been thinking about, even in that short time. And all we did was change the rate and depth of breath and combined it with, evocative sounds, music.
Yeah, there's something magical about doing that. Maybe I should use more triggering words or something quantum. No, there's something really special about about
How dare you use the word quantum in my presence?
about using breath work to occasion an altered state or to dive into the parts of us beneath the surface. And I've always found it interesting that in many languages, the word breath and spirit share the same origin, like pranayama in Sanskrit is control of breath, but also control of life force.
Yeah, and there's so many traditions that use like control of breath, not only to alter sort of mental state, but alter physical capacity. You know, I took martial arts classes when I was young, and one of the things that they would train us in, not that this was just kind of your average suburban middle class karate class, but even there, they taught us to breathe from the diaphragm and not to hold our breath when we were moving, but to use the breath to help us move through these forms or do these particular moves. I remember I dated a girl in high school who was a singer, and one day she was like, "Hey, punch me in the stomach," and I was like, "What? I'm not gonna punch you in the stomach." She's like, "You don't have to hit me hard, but like right here, right, like my solar plexus." And I just kind of like poked her there. It was hard as a rock, and I was like really impressed because I was a high school athlete and thought I was, strong or whatever. And her abs were harder than mine, and she wasn't like an athlete or anything. She's like, "Yeah, it's from singing. It's from all my diaphragm control and practice." And I was
Mhm.
thoroughly impressed.
I've seen that. There's a yoga teacher I like in Australia named Simon Borg Oliver. And when he teaches these workshops, he's like, I don't know, 60 something at least. He'll lay down on the ground. He'll get the biggest possible dude from the crowd to come stand on his belly while he'll
Mm,
just keep lecturing or demonstrating things, just because he has this insane control over his diaphragm and core muscles and bandhas as they call them in yoga.
mm. There's I'm a Marvel superhero movie geek, and then there's an Incredible Hulk movie where Bruce Banner goes to this jujitsu, like Brazilian jujitsu practitioner. I think he's actually the guy in the movie is actually like a real life BJJ guy.
Mm.
Might be one of the Gracies. I can't remember. And so there's a scene where he's teaching him to breathe from his diaphragm, and he just like manipulates his diaphragm like you might manipulate your fingers, like different shapes up and down, side to side, as he's teaching him to breathe, deep with control. And it just, the average human being, we don't get that this is a muscle and it can be trained.
Yeah, yeah, you see it in some of these super yogis where they'll do those waves through
Yeah.
their abdomen. But when I was in my yoga teacher training in New York, there was this one of the senior teachers. I think his name was Yoshi. He was just like a true yogi. But I remember he was demonstrating the activation of these bandhas, and one of them in particular, where you kind of, um, well, you activate both the pelvic floor mula bandha and then this uddiyana bandha, this flying bandha, where you're kind of bringing your abdomen in and up. And when he did that, he was sitting in lotus on a hard floor. And when he did that, he left the ground. Like literally, I have a
Holy
picture of
crap.
him in the air. He just like boom. And then, of course, he came back down. He didn't continue levitating infinitely, but I was
That's
still
good to
blown
know.
away.
How did he pop up off the ground doing that? Did it just like his glutes flex really hard and it just sort of
It was the
popped him
force
up?
of his this upward motion of like the core muscles and the muscles of and around the diaphragm.
Just created momentum,
Yeah,
or,
just
whatever.
popped him up.
Super quantum energy shot out his butthole and sent him up into
Yep.
the air. I don't know.
Yep, that's quantum stuff.
That's incredible.
There's this interesting correlation. I don't know if it means anything. I'll give that disclaimer, but I'll just pass it your way to make of it what you will. But if you look at different mammals, like I don't know, a rabbit has a respiratory rate of, I don't know, 40, 60 breaths per minute, lifespan 5, 6 years. A mouse, uh, I don't know, 75 to 150 breaths a minute, lifespan 2, 3 years. Monkey, 30, 50 breaths a minute, lifespan 20 something years. Um, There's us, humans. Our respiratory rate is 12 to 16, lifespan 70 to 80. Whales, respiratory rate 3 to 5 breaths per minute, lifespan well over 100 years.
I don't know what to make of that.
Slow down your breathing, live longer? Maybe.
Because you hear like we only have so many heartbeats, right? And so, you want to get a good low resting heart rate. Only so many times that muscle can flex.
Yeah. One of my breathing practices that I do is, I guess you could call resonant breathing, or basically it just involves sitting and slowing down your breath to, let's say, 6 breaths per minute or less for some period of time, several minutes at least. And I don't know, that one feels extra powerful, useful for me to really kind of come into this coherence um, s- with the rest of the body, the state of kind of slow, attuned, mindful presence.
Yeah. I like to at least slow down my exhales and then prolong the pause at the bottom of the breath. And for me, that helps me drop into the moment. And especially if I'm feeling tense or anxious, just slow. And I'll do it by creating tension, like in my palate, almost the same way you would create tension to to clear your throat.
Hmm.
So just, and when you exhale, it's audible because of that tension. So you can kind of hear it. And I'm breathing through my nose, not my mouth. And for me, a combination of that, or even try to make a noise like a humming noise, is incredibly calming. Like it gets me there quick.
Darth Vader breathing.
Yeah. Yeah. I was looking on Wim Hof's website. I think it was his website. They even used that term, like Darth Vader breathing, to, I don't know what it does in particular, apart from slow the breathing down. It might stimulate the vagus nerve because it's all up there in the palate. But
It's Well, it ties into that book you mentioned, Nestor's book of nose breathing. It's
mhm.
what Wim Hof points to in some ways. Most schools of yoga practice will tell you to breathe in and out through the nose and slow it down, and to tie it into these like monkey respiratory correlations I mentioned before. And the guy in Australia who I mentioned, Simon, one thing he said once was, fitness is to do more while breathing less. And that stuck
Hmm.
with me. I've thought about that a million times since, because, like, in yoga class, I could be in the most insane thing, upside down, um, contorted. But progress for me on the physical plane, at least, involves doing the same thing, but doing it with more ease and with um, a slower respiratory rate.
That is a great phrase. That's going to stick with me too, because you could say that about mental fitness too. I mean, a lot of times when we're stressed or out of our depth, we're over breathing or panicking. To do more
Yeah.
while breathing less. I like that.
Yeah, so, like, if there's a simple takeaway from our discussion so far, breathing in and out through the nose and breathing slow, and maybe like you said, sometimes we need to put a little extra emphasis on the exhale, and sometimes a pause.
Yeah. So you mentioned James Nestor's book. I can't remember if I talked about it before we hit record or after, but just in case, it's breathe and or breath. I think it's breath. I always forget if there's an E on it or not. But I think it's breath. And it was, man, so I've got mild sleep apnea, and he
Mhm.
talks about sleep apnea in that book. And it just every time I review it or get reminded of it, it's like, oh my gosh, I gotta make sure I'm doing what I need to do at night. I can't fall asleep with that stupid CPAP machine on, but I've done the other things that he suggests. I have uh, they have those like I think the brand name is Breathe Right strips that open your nasal passages. I got this other thing called Intake. It's like the intake breathing apparatus. You could just they've got little stickers that have little pieces of metal in them, and you put them on either side of your nostrils, and then the band that goes over your nose is hard plastic with magnets, so it's a lot more rigid than a breathe right strips, like a band-aid, and it just pulls my nasal passages open, and then I tape my mouth shut at night. So it promotes nasal breathing, which is a lot healthier than mouth breathing. In Nestor's book, he
Mhm.
put silicone plugs up his nose for like 10 days and his health just plummeted because he
Oh,
only
yeah.
mouth breathed.
That's when he volunteered as, like, a subject in the Stanford Sinus Center study, right? And, like, where he did only mouth breathing,
Yeah.
and his blood pressure went up, like, 20 points the first few days.
Uh-huh. It's crazy. And then after he took the plugs out, all those health markers correct themselves within, it was pretty fast, actually, I think.
Yeah, yeah, and his snoring, it's interesting when he was did that thing you were talking about of taping his mouth, he went from snoring for, like, 4 hours of the night to 10 minutes.
Hmm. Yeah. So my wife will be like, "Hey, did you forget to tape your mouth last night?" It does help, even with my apnea, because my apnea is very like positional. If I fall asleep on my back and my jaw collapses and falls back, then it's a lot
Mhm.
worse. And the tape just helps cue my mind to, keep my jaw forward, I guess.
Yeah, interesting, and, maybe to add a little layer of, modern day nerdy science to the breathing less, idea, when you take fewer breaths per minute, you take in more carbon dioxide, and higher CO2 in the body means more oxygen absorption because O2 and the red blood cells want to travel the parts of the body with high CO2. So when O2 molecules leave the bloodstream to enter like our cells and tissues, a CO2 molecule leaves a cell, moves upstream, up the bloodstream. So optimal CO2 levels when we breathe fewer breaths per minute encourage more optimal levels of O2 absorption. I mean, there's a balance, right? There's a middle ground, but the
Right.
easiest way to do this is to slow down the breathing, build up a little bit of CO2 by breathing lighter and less frequently. Taking that, say, from our average 18 breaths a minute in the country to breathing, you know, those practices like I was talking about, doing 6 times a minute. There are studies that show this could bump your CO2 by 25% over a number of minutes. And, uh, and that's yeah, I think that's why that practice both feels so good and does have some health benefits, some longevity benefits.
I've heard that's why the breath hold and in a Wim Hof breathing technique, why the breath hold after like the 30 breaths is so important. So like, cause you're hyperventilating and you want to replenish CO2 with the breath hold. Cause that's that last breath that you let out like 90% and then hold, right?
Hmm. Yeah, and have to expand on the other side of that coin or going too far in that realm. Have you ever had lobster claws during breath work or seen it?
I've seen it. I haven't had it myself.
Yeah, I
Carpal
remember.
pedal or whatever.
Yeah, carpal spasm. But that's a really interesting one. I get asked about a lot because people who have done holotropic or other forms of long breath work practices for not for altered states, I'd say a third of people at some point who do that kind of practice are going to experience tetany. I certainly have, and I've seen people get it for the first time or their first breath work, and it can be jarring. It can even be a little painful. So it's basically where uh, you might have tingling around the mouth, lips. You might have some twitching, but the lobster claws, where you have these carpal spasms, where you have a contracture in your arm, but it's basically a hyperventilation syndrome from where you're blowing off too much CO2 and you get in this respiratory alkalosis because blowing off CO2 raises the pH, more alkaline in your blood, constricts your vessels. And that is what leads to like numbness, tingling, muscle twitching in these certain parts of the body. Um, and you can usually prevent it by breathing a more optimal balanced rate of inhales versus exhales, but sometimes it's just because someone's dehydrating or they have a little um, low calcium, magnesium, or potassium, for example. But one more thing to add is Stan Groff actually likes that. He calls it he says it's not a pathological condition, it's a process with healing potential because it creates this biochemical situation that facilitates the emergence of old emotional physical tensions.
Hmm. And that sounds very Stan Groff, right? I mean, the little bit that I know about what he's said about holotropic breath work is, it's very much trusting the process, trusting the manifestation of the inner healing intelligence, that you do the work. You don't bring any like your own theory or interpretation of what's happening, or guidance to the process. You do the breath work to unleash, the inner healing intelligence. So whatever shows up should show up.
Yeah, and unleash is a good term for it in this because, like, he's like, this is a unique opportunity for stuff in the unconscious realm with a strong emotional charge to bust out.
Right. So I'm glad you brought it up because I think a lot of people approaching certainly holotropic breath work, they go to their local yoga studio that's doing it or whatever, might be alarmed if they see it or if it happens to them because, it looks like a stroke or it looks like, somebody
Mhm.
having a major medical event and that might require intervention. Like if it's happening and it's really, really painful for somebody, um, is there a way to resolve it quickly?
Yeah, so quickly depends on the individual, but you basically stop the hyperventilation and
Mhm.
let it resolve on its own. And that is one of the nice things about psychedelic breath work versus ayahuasca or
Right.
I am ketamine, for example. Uh, you can dial it back. You can turn it off. It's more like IV ketamine, where you were dripping someone a little bit of ketamine, and we're like, "Whoa, they're having a hard time. Turn it off." Um,
So you
but
can
then, yeah,
just
they can.
stop the breath work practice and they'll likely resolve in a while, just depending on the
Yeah,
person and their hydration and electrolyte
yeah,
balance.
yeah. In reality, and Stan Groff might disagree. He might say, "Lean in, keep going."
Yeah.
But you can, from my perspective, like I like a balanced perspective. Yeah, you let things emerge. You trust the inner healer, but also um, we also respect physiology and our body cues about hydration and electrolytes and things like that, and we don't have to punish ourselves unnecessarily. But
Right.
yeah, you can, like, if it starts happening to me, I'll just slow down the breathing a bit,
Mhm.
or maybe take a pause, take a sip of water, something like that.
So you mentioned ayahuasca, and I've heard people compare holotropic breath work ceremonies or sessions to ayahuasca ceremonies, in that they're often done in group contexts, right?
Hmm.
And that they often, they last a little while. I think ayahuasca probably lasts a little bit longer than a holotropic session,
Yep.
but people tend to experience similar things, like these non-ordinary states, but non-ordinary states that often involve, that's for some people involve transformations. People will shapeshift. You have people crawling around like animals, making noises and stuff. People experiencing rebirths or connection to past lives. It gets real trippy, and all you're doing is breathing. So people like to speculate that you're, and you maybe I'm going to ask you in case you know more about this, like if it's more than speculation about releasing in what's the word, basically your body's own source of DMT. Like are we releasing DMT when we're doing holotropic breath work, or is it something else?
Well, um, so that's still up for debate in the scientific literature.
That's what I thought.
Not the effects of DMT, like inhaled or IV, and NDMT or 5-MeO DMT, of course. Um, those are intense psychedelic experiences. But the deeper I go on the literature around the brain's natural release of DMT, both while alive in response to certain practices and at time of death, is so mixed. It's a debate that rages on without a clear answer and or a clear consensus.
Yeah, I just wanted to lay that out there for people because you'll often hear people in the podcast space or YouTube space or whatever
Yeah.
who love to talk about endogenous DMT, and they'll make sort of declarative statements about it. And I think you're right. Right, the science is not conclusive. So
We
let's
just don't
not.
know.
Yeah, we just don't know, and it's okay not to know. We can have interesting theories, but what we can say is what we observe. What we observe is that people doing this type of breath work experience or report experiencing very similar phenomena that you might experience with a psychedelic like DMT.
Yeah. Yeah. And if we understood everything, that would be quite boring, wouldn't it? Leaving
Yeah.
out the mystery of life.
I was talking to my kids yesterday about the grand mystery, because sometimes my kids will hear things from friends, or they'll hear something on YouTube. Dad, guess what? Did you know that this is the way something is? And I'll be like, is it really? And and then invite some skepticism, and then yeah, we talked a bit about the grand mystery and how that keeps life interesting.
Yeah, it does. It does. So while we're on the topic of psychedelic breath work, I mean, I lump these practices into a bucket term called psychedelic breath work,
Hmm.
in contrast to the breathwork practices that one might engage in for breath control and meditative, non-psychedelic intentions. But maybe we can go over those a little bit, like the holotropic versus other um, camps, and these emerged roughly around the '60s. Interestingly, with Stan Groff bringing holotropic breath work, but Leonard Orr was the one who kind of started this rebirthing breath work when he was sitting in a tub in the '60s and did this connected deep breathing practice in warm water. Um, and then a bunch of other shamanic and different names of practices that um, people are doing more and more these days.
Yeah, I'm not as familiar with all the different types. I think holotropic's probably the one that comes up the most, probably in part because it's well marketed. But Stan and Christina were very much involved in early LSD research, and so when it became illegal, I think there was a move to the practice as it for similar therapeutic benefits that they were experiencing with LSD.
Yeah, and some people even trademark them. Like um, there's this one. I think Judith Kravitz started transformational breath work. I think it's trademarked as, but it's a conscious connected one, deep and slow, done through mouth or nose. But there are others by like Michael Stone. There's David Elliott has, I think, a three-part breath that's more yang, like you drop in quicker. And then a lot of, as I mentioned earlier, shamanic practices. There's another rebirthing one by Sandra Ray, I think. But what's interesting to me is what they have in common is, well, their journeys that bring about altered states of consciousness. There's often a music component with an
Hmm.
arc to it. Like, could be live music, could be shamanic drumming, it could be a playlist, but with a peak and a come down, like a yang and a yin phase. There's often an intention and integration. There's a catharsis around it. And there's also
Hmm.
like a common shift if you look at the studies of them, and there are more and more studies, but a shift from beta brainwaves, if you're looking at an EEG, are daytime normal default mode, to slower waves like alpha, theta, even gamma. And Yeah, so they're really interesting practices and different flavors and varieties. But I'm of the opinion that just like in spiritual and contemplative practices, you just find one that works for you, that hits the components, and there's not really a wrong or right answer or one true church in that regard.
I like that because as you were describing that, I was reading from. This is kind of the cool thing about doing this online is I can look at websites and and my notes at the same time. But I'm reading from the Groff's website on holotropic breathwork, and it's basically describing exactly what you just described. And it's probably not necessarily unique. Well, not probably. You just laid it out. Not unique to their approach, but they talk about holotropic combining accelerated breathing with evocative music in a special set and setting, with eyes closed, lying on a mat. Each person uses their own breath and the music in the room to enter not an ordinary state. The state activates like we were saying earlier, the natural inner healing process of the individual's psyche, bringing the
Hmm.
seeker a particular set of internal experiences with the inner healing intelligence guiding the process. The quality and content brought forth is unique to each person for that particular time and place. While recurring themes are common, no two sessions are ever alike.
Mm. So over the years, there have been a number of studies done on holotropic breath work. Like I think in the 90s, there was one that showed when holotropic breath work was combined with a little psychotherapy, there was a reduction in death anxiety and an increase in self esteem. There's one like, I don't know, in the 2000s where holotropic breath work, yeah, interesting, better communication with others and increased insights about the world. One in 2013 that showed it kind of um, just proved the hypothesis in the small study, at least the best it could, that there was some emotional catharsis and it was low risk, it was safe. And then I think there was one even later, more recently, that showed increased self awareness and some character improvements that I thought this was really interesting, less needy and slower to react in anger.
Hmm, that's interesting. So if I'm writing the discussion section of these studies, right, where I get to speculate um, on why we think these improvements are happening, I'm wondering in my mind, is it the same reasons we think that psychedelics are helping people? Because we can think that we can make speculations about specific neurotransmitter changes or neuroplasticity, like all these physiological changes that are happening as a result of people using psychedelic medicines. But there's also just the experiences that we tend to have on psychedelics that seem to track with some of the experiences people have in this psychedelic breath work, where you experience oneness, like you said, emotional catharsis. You're brought into the present moment in a dramatic way, and you have what, like you've called before on the podcast, a corrective emotional experience. Um, and all of these things are we like. It's like we need more of these kinds of experiences, regardless of the things we suffer from. They're just it's good medicine for what ails us as a result of being human in modern society.
Yeah, and I can tell you in my life, there is not another tool I can think of that has been more useful for me to self regulate, to surf the wave of difficult things and make it to the other side as my breath. Like I use it all the time, and people notice it if I'm going for like a 10 out of 10 deep pressure massage, for example. I just naturally like engage that yoga breathing, or if I'm having my wisdom teeth out and decline anesthesia and they're crunching in there with local numbing only, I just breathe. Or anything anything difficult, I just default to breathing through it, and it has just gotten me through so much.
Yeah, I mean this podcast is as much for me as it is for our listeners because breath and breath work is something I've always felt drawn to, but never really committed to until very recently. And man, nothing like getting sick with an upper respiratory infection to remind you how important your breath is when you can't breathe through your nose.
Oh
Fortunately, I
yeah.
haven't been too congested, but like the fire in my lungs to remind you how important breath is. But I like to exercise, but most of what I do is resistance training and weight training, and then I'll go like on a at least now, but then I'll go like on a hike and get with a buddy of mine who's an ultra marathoner and be out of breath like by the time I get out of the car, and um, it just reminds me how out of shape I am cardiovascularly and respiratorily or whatever. It's not a word, but um, so yeah, I'm committing to explore breath work to enhance those skills the way you described your skills, Reid, but also to just get my lung capacity higher so that I can enjoy life for longer.
Yeah, do more while breathing less.
There you go.
Another benefit of breath work is I've never found, well, you know, there are very few things that help me tap into the inner reserves of energy that I found as breath work. Someone once told me that once you hit your, I don't know, 30s or 40s, you better you better have ways of tapping into energy within yourself, because naturally our infinite stores of boundless energy spilling out that we have from like the time we're a toddler through adolescence in our 20s, it starts to change, right? Naturally with the cycles of life and hormones. But There's even a pranayama practice, a yoga-based breathing practice called the Kapalabhati, the breath of fire, that is also happens to be called the yogic cup of joe because of it's like drinking a cup of coffee, but that's where you're um, exhaling with some force. Um, you're just focusing on like this pumping of breath that really gets the energy moving. And so when I did my yoga training, many years ago, the main thing I took back from that is from these teachers who I really admired. They'd say, if you don't have time for your yoga practice in the morning, drop it, but don't drop your pranayama, your breath practice. At least
Mm.
do these things. Like, and some of it is just some simple breath control. Some of it is some breath hold. Some of it is some like fiery practices, like those Kapalabhati, for example.
Yeah, that breath of fire is one thing I have been playing around with, and we talked about it a little bit, I think, on our last episode when we did that cold plunge. Um,
Yeah.
but I've been playing around with like using breath to heat myself, and I know Wim Hof's all about this, right? But I'm an amateur right now, but it's been effective. I've been taking cold showers and then just like controlling my breath, and it's incredible. It's incredible what I can
Mhm.
endure.
Yeah, I really appreciate Wim Hof in all his quirkiness. I really appreciate what he's brought to the world in terms of breath work and breathing practices and exposure to cold. But in lieu of podcasting last Friday, when we normally do, it was actually quite convenient that you got sick. Thank you, Steve, because I got to
My pleasure.
go into the river with my 2 sons and my brother and do some cold plunges, but, like, our ritual, speaking of, like, making things sacred, is to do a few rounds of Wim Hof, basic Wim Hof before we plunge and do that 2 or 3 times, but it's just, like, uh, 30 pumps of really deep, aggressive breaths, and then emptying the lungs and breath hold for a minute or however long you want or can. And then just one more inhale, hold for 10 seconds, and then go plunge.
Yeah, we should probably make the PSA that don't do this while you're in the water.
Mhm.
Like I've heard that said about a lot of breath work. Like there might be some breath work techniques that you can do well in water, but I've heard it said like don't do Wim Hof while you're in the water because you could black out, and that's not good.
Yeah, the idea when you're in the cold is to remember that mantra we were talking about earlier, do more while breathing less. Like, you know, find the most relaxed state you can and don't hyperventilate because
Right.
then you can rest in that state longer before you freak out.
Yeah, I remember I was listening to an interview with Josh Waitzkin on Tim Ferriss' podcast. He's the guy I think the movie Searching for Bobby Fischer was based on. He's
Hmm.
chess prodigy, brilliant guy. Uh, but yeah, I guess he was doing, maybe it was Wim Hof or another kind of breathing practice while in his pool, and he to increase breath hold time, and he blacked
Hmm.
out, and his wife just happened to have found him at the bottom of the pool, and so he survived. But yeah,
Wow,
cautionary tale.
that's wild. Huh.
Yeah.
Another important point that's coming to mind for me is when we talk about meditation. Uh, we recommend meditation a lot. We talk about mindfulness all the time. But it strikes me that the most common reaction we get from our clients and from even friends and family in response to a recommendation to try meditation or their attempts at meditation is like, no way, that was nuts. My mind was going a zillion miles a minute. That was difficult. It was too difficult. And
Too hard. Yeah.
yeah, it makes sense to me, and that's why I really recommend more starting with a breathing practice as a gateway. It's almost a prerequisite in my mind to use the breath as a tool to settle the mind into more of a silent space, because and then meditation can unfold more naturally. But there's an order of things, I think.
What would you suggest to somebody as like a bare minimum intro breathing practice?
Well, that's the nice thing about breathing is you can just tune into your breath for 2 minutes a day, and that's beautiful. You could do you could do any one of the apps out there. Headspace, Calm, Sam Harris's Waking Up Intro to Meditation course, and they will bring in the mindful breathing as part of it for the most part, because it is pretty much a tried and tested concept um, that for most people um, is uh, is one of the most useful tools for getting into a meditative state, and it applies to psychedelic journeys as well. One of the most useful skills we give our clients in the preparation phase before dosing sessions, some basic breath work, like whether it's the presence process by Michael Brown, or a simple mindful based breathing, or any other flavor.
So when I was first learning meditation, um, and was given the instruction to tune into my breath or to pay attention to my breathing, my experience, and I imagine some people's experience mirrors mine, um, was that when I paid attention to my breath, I could not help but take over. Like I could not help but take voluntary control of my breath. I couldn't follow it without taking the steering wheel. And I would notice I would started to feel a little bit more anxious, not more calm, when I paid attention to my breath. And I have kind of a neurotic disposition, so this is not surprising. But um, so when you're helping people with this particular issue, what might be a coaching cue for them? Is it more just sort of surrender and pay attention and practice, and eventually it'll happen, or what?
To get around that
Tendency to like
challenge.
take control, yeah.
Yeah. So, well, first of all, use the breath um, as a window or a signal, or um, kind of a barometer of what's going on inside. Like if I when I stand on my mat in the morning, or sit on my meditation cushion, first thing I'll do is just listen. Like, is my breathing shallow, choppy? Which it often is, especially if is it nervous and tense, because that's just a window to my mind. My mind is probably nervous and tense if my breath is strained or erratic. Um, and I just remember to be gentle with myself, and first observe, and then just slight shifts of deepening. Like, say you're breathing in and out through your nose while sitting there. You're just going gently there. You're not trying to do the best Darth Vader breathing hyperventilation 0 to 60 immediately. Um, and then you notice that when the breath is more even and rhythmic, the mind is more clear and balanced. And because it's that bridge between conscious and unconscious, you can start to cross that bridge. But it is a patient, slow process. And to this day, I won't try to rush it.
Yeah, that makes sense. Because sometimes, like, as I experimented with this process myself, and I just like, okay, just pay attention to your breathing without doing anything. Just watch your breathing. And on my watch, I'd check my heart rate, and my heart rate would go up first. I don't know if it's just a Steve thing, like I get anxious when I'm paying attention to my breath, or what it is, but um, and then it wasn't until I like would then deliberately slow it down the way I described earlier with those longer exhales that my heart rate would then go down.
Yeah.
Um,
So the if but to get a little more specific, if I'm teaching like yoga based breathing, and just for fun, the Sanskrit terms of those um, in this pranayama realm are: puraka is the inhalation, kumbhaka is breath hold or retention, and richaka is the exhalation. But if someone's new to it, I'll recommend that they only practice the puraka and rechaka. Like, don't do the retention, because we do have this natural response to CO2 rising, where we're going to panic and we're going to hurry and take a breath. Um, the Oxygen Advantage book by Patrick, someone or other, is really good and talks a lot about that. Um,
Mm.
but and like you said, there is this ratio of like 1 to 2, for example, inhale to exhale. That's really useful. That I'll often have people start with a slightly longer exhale because that's what most of us do need to work on. And then when you do add the retention in between, you might do a ratio of like 1, 4, 2, like, and you can multiply that by whatever you want, meaning 1 count inhale, 4 hold, 2 exhale, or 2 counts inhale, 8 hold. And there's a million variations of this, but that's one way I'll dish it out to, like in yoga teacher trainings or workshops.
I like that. Yeah, it doesn't have to be super fancy, right? And it's, I mean, really, the act of just simply paying attention to your breath and then slowing it down could be enough of an instruction for somebody. But I like these, like counts. We can tell people to box breathe. There's these simple ways of making it easier for people.
You wanna hear a quote by Sri Swami Sivananda just for fun?
Do I? Yeah.
I bet you do now, huh? So Sri Swami says, just as there is connection between wind and fire or light, so also there is connection between prana and mind. Wind fans the fire, prana also fans the mind. If there's no wind, fire, or light, get steady. Yogis approach Brahman, aka conscious bliss, the highest reality, by controlling prana, breath, life force.
Yeah. Like I was saying earlier about my breath of fire practice, it's definitely lights up my mind. And what I've tried to start doing is in the afternoon when I feel my energy waning a bit, instead of grabbing another caffeinated beverage, I'll do some breath of fire.
You know what's funny about what you just said is Kapalabhati, breath of fire. If you actually translate it literally from Sanskrit, Kapala means skull, Bhati means shine. So it's actually skull shining breath that lights up Steve's mind.
Well, my skull shines on its own. It's one of the benefits of having a shaved bald head, but maybe breathing can increase the luster of my bald head. Isn't that what Tumo? I was looking at Tumo breathing. Translates as inner fire. I read, practiced by Tibetan monks.
Yeah, yeah, and that's kind of the big predecessor to a lot of Wim Hof practices. To be honest, I mean, it all comes from these like, well, these ancient civilizations in very different parts of the world, whether it's Taoism, Buddhism, Hinduism, old Christianity, even. Qigong, Sufism, the martial arts have their own, and shamanism has their own. Um, and I just have this bias in the or personal path for me has been more in the yogic based pranayama practices. And what's interesting there is um, the kind of yoga I gravitate to or default to the most is called Ashtanga, and Ashtanga means the 8 limb path. And there are in Ashtanga, these 8 limbs are, first, um, first is the postures. Well, you have the yamas and niyamas, like the foundation of moral restraints and observances beforehand, because it essentially gives you superpowers and you want to aim them in the right direction towards ethical good and compassion. But then you get into the asanas, the yoga poses. Then you get into pranayama, control the breath, control the mind, before you even start to move towards meditation. Then it's like pratyahara, turning inward, withdrawal of senses, dharana, concentration. Dhyana is you finally start to meditate, and then the 8th limb is samadhi, or pure unbounded awareness. And it really speaks to what we were talking about earlier, where there's a sequence of things, and you can't jump right into meditation, for most people anyway, without learning to be able to sit comfortably, like doing some stretching, and learning to control the breath to clear the mind, and learning to aim your intention and all that stuff.
Yeah, I like that. I like what you're saying. I think that'll help a lot of people. This idea that if you've been intimidated by meditation, that meditation, the way it's often sold to you, doesn't have to be the place you start. That breath and body can be more accessible and a better place to start.
Yeah, it's kind of like, so you want to learn to fly a plane. You might spend a lot of time in the classroom first, but you're not going to fly a plane without, of course, the practice. But you do have to understand it, and you have to do some of the other practices, like learning your pre-flight checks and everything else. But like learn the operate the big mechanics and then into the subtleties of it. Before your plane can actually take off, you even have to do some things. And pranayama, breath control, is does show up before meditation. It's like the fourth limb, and meditation is the seventh. So between them, there are these three other limbs, and it's very hard to just jump into the other ones. Even like the more advanced you are in breath control, the more able you are to use the energy of the body, the life force, to access the other limbs, including the next one, which is withdrawal of the senses. Like, that's not that easy to do. Like, if you just try sitting there quiet for a moment without feeling or touching or smelling or sensing or looking or listening to anything, that's hard. Um, and then we can get into concentration, when all your life force can be directed at one thing only. Again, pretty hard to do, especially these days. Um, and then that's finally when the plane can take off, or when another analogy is like when the cucumber detaches from a plant because it's ready, but you don't yank it off prematurely. That's when all the other limbs are in place and when you're ready to meditate or fly.
Mm, yeah, I like that. Well, Reed, is there anything else about breath or any tools that we want to point people toward um, that might help them explore this on their own?
Yeah, it's a good question.
There is one YouTube channel that I really like for just real quick breath work exercises, and that's Breathwork Beats. It used to be
hmm
called like DMT breathing or whatever, but I think they might have changed it. So
Oh yeah.
Breathwork Beats, and they have they're really, I mean, they're really well produced, but just really quick exercises with all kinds of outlandish promises about how it's going to change your life. But another one is an app that you mentioned, a couple of the great meditation apps. I discovered a new, I think it's relatively new app that's specific for breath work called Othership. And of course, we don't get any kickbacks for mentioning these products, but Othership I've been playing around with it. It's pretty intuitive and well produced. Again, just real quick breathwork exercises to music and beats.
Yeah, I think another book I've really enjoyed is Heart, Breath, Mind by Dr. Leah Lagos. You hear about it on some podcasts these days. It's a pretty new book, but it actually gets into using your breath and as a tool to actually calm your nervous system in general, increase your heart rate variability, which we didn't talk about, but is one of the kind of physiologic measurements we can use about our nervous system state. And to attain this state of kind of coherence between mind and heart and breath. And she actually, through this book, goes through her whole program that she normally would do in very expensive workshops or personal coaching with CEOs and athletes, and I think she's in California, but you can access it through that book. And in there, she also recommends a lot of ways of like using apps to practice, using devices to measure your HRV and things like that.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, we also didn't talk in great detail about using breathwork as a psychedelic integration, right? If you're getting psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, and your therapist is talking to you about integration, there's lots of ways that we've talked about on this podcast, of course, to integrate those experiences. But a breathwork practice is a great one of those great tools to work on integration, in as much as it does the things that we've talked about in today's episode.
I just got this book called Somatic Internal Family Systems Therapy
Oh,
because,
cool.
we just did that, as you know, you did it too, but that like foundational IFS training. I'm going deeper and deeper on that path. But this is a book that caught my eye. But the approach outlined by the author to get to this embodied self, this integrated self, is well, number one is somatic awareness, and number two is conscious breathing.
Mm.
Moving further into like you get into radical resonance, mindful movement, attuned touch, and then towards the embodied self. But I think it's a really fun somatic take on parts work.
Mm. You have to tell me what you think. That does sound really interesting. And that term conscious breathing, I believe there was a book written by Gay Hendricks by that title. One of my dissertation chair gave it to me when I was complaining to him about feeling anxious in graduate school. He's like, "Here, read this.
Yeah,
Conscious
yeah.
breathing."
So, other resources, I mentioned Michael Brown, and his book, The Presence Process, is a pretty deep dive into connected breathing, breath-based meditation practices. There's so many books, but we're picking and choosing some ones, I guess, that have really impacted us. And then apps, I think we're both fans of the Waking Up app and the introductory
Hmm.
course. There are a lot of ways you can go there, but also Insight Timer is a gold mine if you can navigate it, of both guided meditations, and if you pay for it, the courses, the multi-day courses, and a lot of good ones. If you read the reviews and ask us, email in to the podcast. We'll
Yeah.
probably do another episode on breath.
Yeah, I think we will. Anybody, if you listeners have anybody that you want us to reach out to, maybe get on the podcast, um, who could school us a little bit more on breath or any other topic for that matter, please email us. I always drop that in the intro and when I think in the outro, but
Hmm.
psychfrontiers at novamind.ca is our email address. If you're watching on YouTube, you can always drop a comment below.
I've got one more quote spam nugget of Rumi wisdom to leave with you if you'd like it
Sweet. Please.
on breath. So, from our favorite Sufi poet, Rumi, there is one way of breathing that is shameful and constricted. Then there's another way, a breath of love that takes you all the way to infinity.
All the way to infinity. I love it. Well, let's end this with a nice deep breath. I managed to do it without coughing. That's a good sign.
And get well soon, Steve.
Thank you very much. Thank you, dear listener, for listening. It means a lot to me. Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers is brought to you by Novamind, a mental health company that specializes in psychedelic medicine and research. You can learn more about Novamind's mission to increase access to legal, safe, and evidence-based psychedelic medicine at novamind.ca. If you like what you heard, please subscribe to the podcast on whatever platform you're using to listen or watch. Also, if you're feeling generous today, please leave us a glowing review on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever you like to listen. If you'd like to reach out to us with questions, suggestions, scathing criticisms, etc., please email us at psychfrontiers@novamind.ca. Thanks again. The content of this podcast does not constitute medical advice or mental health treatment. Please consult a medical or mental